Hi, everyone. Welcome to this brief teach-in on abolition and Peel. Uh, Climate Justice Peel is really happy to have everyone here with us. And we're also feeling really lucky that we have Andrea Vasquez Jimenez, the co-director of Lane, notable community organizer, academic, and politician here with us as well. So before we sort of get into the teach-in itself, just want to introduce Climate Justice Peel. We're a grassroots group of mostly young folks based in Peel who are addressing the climate crisis by tackling its roots causes, which are capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy. We firmly believe abolition is climate justice. So that's a little bit about us. We're on Instagram and Facebook as well. So you can check us out and find out more ways to get involved. Before we move on to the housekeeping segment, we want to acknowledge that we're on stolen land. We're on land that has been under the care of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Petun, and many other nations, recorded and unrecorded, for thousands of years. It is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. The current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and this territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. This is an agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee that binds them to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. The absence of a knife within this treaty describes the need to maintain peace for the benefit of all. As settlers ourselves on lands currently known as Mississauga and Brampton, we come to this land by head of the lake, Treaty Number 14, and adjutants, Treaty Number 19, as well as Treaty 13. We want to make it clear that all non-Indigenous folks must act in solidarity with Indigenous struggles for self-determination and center Indigenous sovereignty in our movements. So before we get to the meaty parts of the brief teach-in, I'm just going to go over some housekeeping rules so folks are aware of what's going on, what the schedule for today looks like. So basically, we're a little bit behind, but I think still on time. So we're going from 6 to 7:30. So first we're going to start with the short teach-in on abolition. Then we're going to be very lucky to have Andrea talk us through hashtag police free schools. And then we're going to do a little bit of a collective vision activity, which will use an additional platform. There will be a link and a code to get into that. So hopefully you have a smart device or a phone nearby if you're on your computer. And fourth, we'll do a Q&A session. So we're recording this in two parts, and we're going to share this recording afterwards. There's also going to be closed captioning, so if you require closed captioning, you can turn that on. We have active listeners as well during this session, so if you need to check in with someone at any point, their names are Mezun, so MZ, and Peninda, so you can message them personally using the chat option, and they will speak to you. 1 second, I lost the page.
Sorry about that, that's me.
So our questions, we did get a number of questions from you during the registration forms, and we address a few of them in the upcoming content. For other questions, we will be able to get into some of them during the session, and for others, we will link resources that you can read afterwards, and we'll post those links on our social medias and also follow up with you guys. We also want to make it clear that none of us are experts, us being the facilitators from, who are currently facilitating this brief teach-in from Climate Justice Peel. No one's an expert on abolition. It's a lifelong practice and lens through which we organize and build power. We also really want to give credit to Black abolitionists who have been doing this work for centuries and years. This is meant to be an introduction and a launching pad for further conversations on abolition and Peel. If you have suggestions for specific topics for any future series, please let us know. It will take many, 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 many conversations for us to work through these questions as a community. And again, just centering the fact that we have the decades-long work of Black abolitionists and organizers to thank and honor. And we as facilitators today also want to acknowledge that we don't have lived experience of incarceration and the kind of criminalization facing Black and Indigenous folks. We also want to honor that there's a lot of knowledge in the Zoom room. And before we really get into it, just want to throw out a content warning that there will be some content shared here that is disturbing. For example, instances of police brutality and death. And if this is distressing to you, obviously leave, take the time that you need. You can also reach out to our active listeners, Mezun, MZ, and Peninda as well through the chat option, and they're here to support you. So yay, really excited to get into it now. Thanks, everyone.
All right, folks. Thank you, Sav, for that introduction and for housekeeping. We're going to get right into it, talking about how we conceptualize abolition as a community here in Peel specifically, but I want to kind of begin with a broad view of what the word means as a practice, how it's enacted globally. So this particular moment in history might be a time where a lot of folks are hearing the word abolition for the first time, especially in the context of policing and prisons. And at its core, abolition is about changing everything. So Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is a Black feminist scholar and abolitionist, has been thinking about this for decades, and how abolition necessarily means dismantling the conditions that allow for prisons, police, state violence, and other forms of institutionalized harm. So abolition has existed since the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, and it continues to seek the uprooting of systems that were derived from slavery. And it's for this reason that police and prisons are actually a reform. So what I mean by that is that the prison and policing movements post-emancipation in Canada, the US, and in England are why prisons and police exist today. So they're a reform for chattel slavery. Canada's well-documented history of slavery is often and also left out of the conversation about policing. We can often see clear links between racist policing in the US because of its direct links to transatlantic slavery and its legacy through Jim Crow laws and the civil rights movement. But we must remember that the RCMP were formed specifically to remove Indigenous peoples from the land through state-sanctioned violence and residential schools. So how can you reform something that is meant to uphold the basic tenets of slavery and state violence? So the roots of the word reform actually mean to reshape or to bring back to the original condition. And this assumes that there's an underlying legitimacy and necessity for policing and prisons in the first place. You may have heard of Nordic models of prisons and policing, where imprisoned people live in college dorm style cells. They're given permission to garden, to roam the prison grounds without supervision. And this still upholds a criminal to cop relationship in which imprisoned people are still at the behest and the mercy of the state and its officers. So we don't need nicer prisons that receive greater funding for educational programs, and we don't need cops that are given increased budgets to hold neighborhood barbecues, for example. But we do need to defund and decarcerate budgets and systems to put these social programs into the hands of the community. So that accountability, it's lateral, so it's between people, and it's decided between folks who have caused harm and people who have been harmed, who are ultimately given full agency to go about processes of restorative justice. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks a lot about this concept of organized abandonment, which is that the Canadian state and its officers do to people and communities, which is what the Canadian state and its officers do to people and communities who can't meet its capitalist demands. So if you don't fit into a really, really specific idea of affluence, race, ability, gender, sexuality, whiteness, then you're more likely to be discarded because you can't contribute to Canada's ongoing project of settler colonialism. We need to remind ourselves that resisting all kinds of oppression is essential to abolition work, and Black feminists such as Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore are predominantly anti-imperialist and socialist, and this underlines all of their work.
So here's some examples of abolitionist organizing. They're quite broad, but we wanted to share some so you can see the ways in which we can think about abolition as a practice. So yesterday, if you saw in the news, Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, led by student organizers, pressured the school board trustees to terminate the Hamilton Police School Liaison Program, basically saying we want cops out of schools in Hamilton Wentworth School District School Board. PASAN, we will be sending links out later so you can follow up on looking into these organizations. But PASAN is an organization based in Toronto that provides support, education, and advocacy to prisoners and ex-prisoners across Canada. And one really important piece of their work is that they publish Cell Count, which is a newsletter by and for people who are incarcerated. Maggie's Toronto is another great organization that's run for and by sex workers. And their mission is to assist sex workers in efforts to live and work with dignity and safety. And that includes campaigns such as Justice for Mocha, which was supporting Mocha Dawkins, who is out now and has a really amazing podcast that just got released, which you should all listen to. We will share the link. But it really is about advocating for sex workers and changing even the legal conditions under which sex work happens. And then the final example on the slide is the CFRC Prison Radio. So this is a radio station that features news, interviews, writing, and documentaries about prisoners and prison issues. And it is broadcast into a number of prisons, both in Ontario and a little bit in the US. There's a few other examples from the US, which we'll share later on, that are focused on transformative justice and also thinking about how to decriminalize efforts to support survivors of gender-based violence.
Folks will just have to give us a second while we transition over closed captioning.
Hi everyone, my name's Simran. Now we're going to talk about something that has been in the media a lot and really popularized by the uprisings in the US, especially based in Minneapolis, which is to say defunding the police. So in order to understand where we want to go with defunding the police, we have to look at our history and ask ourselves the question, who do the police exist to protect and serve? Why are they even here? And so when we look at the history of Canada, we see that the history of the police force here is rooted in colonialism, in the RCMP, previously the Northwest Mounted Police, Canada's colonial cops. And when we look at history, we actually see that these police officers, as part of the RCMP, were actually created in order to dispossess Indigenous nations of their land and to use it for settler capitalist infrastructure. And there's lots of examples of this, from Canadian Pacific Railway construction that was facilitated by the RCMP through forcibly relocating Indigenous nations and breaking migrant worker strikes, enforcing colonial policies like the pass system in residential schools, crushing worker strikes like the 1919 Winnipeg strike, obviously the RCMP's core role in missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit folks, as well as quelling Indigenous resistance over centuries, and now recently, of course, being involved in the RCMP invasion on unceded Wet'suwet'en lands. And we know also in the last couple of weeks, in fact, since the pandemic started, at least 9 Indigenous people have been killed at the hands of the police, particularly the RCMP. In addition to the RCMP, the land that we're on right now in this region of Peel is actually named after Sir Robert Peel, who is the father of modern policing, from the British Empire and really conceptualized policing in England, London. And he really emphasized this idea of community policing under the Peelian principles. Some of you may laugh at that, but it was conceptualized as policing by consent to prevent crime and disorder as a relationship with community. And so, of course, when we read this, we have to ask ourselves, under British colonial rule, what was considered crime, what was considered community? Definitely not Black, Indigenous, and otherwise poor or migrant workers. And there's examples under this institution of policing, for instance, in Toronto, where the police force directly collaborated with the Catholic Church to repress communists and would turn over delinquent youth over to the Catholic Church. And later on in the 1900s, this institution of policing was further entrenched and professionalized, which is why a lot of us are now learning that the modern institution of policing, at least in the US, is rooted in slave patrols. So when we think about who the police exist to serve and protect, remember that they were designed to protect and serve capitalist and colonial interests. And that makes the police force racist and white supremacist by design. Okay, so we've established that the police are not here to protect us. Now on to solutions. A lot of people are, of course, keen to think about reforms. And I think about Angela Davis and what she mentioned at a webinar recently, saying that we're actually trapped in a treadmill of reform. And she said that the problem is that reforms have often rendered the institution itself more permanent, right? Prisons, like Shreya mentioned, are a reform and a mutation of slavery. The police are also a reform of colonial cops and slave patrols. So when we're thinking about what types of reforms we want that pull us closer to abolitionism, there are some key questions that some very smart people, organizers, have posed. 1, does that reform increase money to the police? 2, does it reduce the scale of the police? 3, does it de-link the police from ideas of safety? And of course, there's many other questions folks like Dean Spade have asked as well, which is, does a reform leave out marginalized groups? Does it create binaries of deserving and undeserving? So a lot of the responses that we've seen from the state and people in power is to actually, kneel or paint murals and not actually enact systemic change. And this is meant to quell dissent and to domesticate our resistance. And an example of that is the 8 Can't Wait campaign during the uprisings that was initially conceptualized as a reform, but we know that a lot of those reforms were actually already in place in American cities and they weren't working. So Black abolitionists came out with 8 to Abolition to actually connect what abolition through the defunding of the police means in addition to demilitarization and investing in communities. So we encourage folks to check out the 8 to Abolition website, which we'll also send afterwards. So I like to think about, a lot of folks in their questions to us while registering asked, how can we talk about abolition with our families? An analogy I really like is this kitchen analogy, this fun picture of cops in a kitchen. So let's say you're a cook, a real nice cook, but a couple of cooks in your kitchen regularly poison the food of your Black and Indigenous customers. And then you find out the cooks have been getting recipes from management that are designed to cause harm to those customers for decades. If you continue to protect the cooks instead of the people paying for the food and being harmed, then logically that restaurant should be shut down. And in its place, we can actually create maybe a community cafeteria, something that's run by us, for us. Maybe it's a co-op and it provides food for everyone. And I like to look at that as an example of abolition because we are fundamentally abolishing the conditions through which this violence happens. So the reason we're all here is to talk about defunding and abolishing the police, as well as other things. Defunding the police means reducing and eventually eliminating the power and money afforded to the police. And this is a process that will take time, a gradual process of strategically and allocating resources, funding, and responsibility away from the police, as a group named MPD 50 describes. And it also means that we're then investing that money into community care, public housing, decent jobs for all, youth programming, education, transformative justice. And this comes at a time when all of our communities are also bearing the brunt of austerity. You know, our healthcare, education, and housing keeps getting cut, but the police keep getting more money. And on top of that, defunding the police means there's also less supply to populate prisons. Defunding the police and prisons go hand in hand, which is why it's so incredible that we saw under the pandemic that there was a 30% decarceration in Ontario prisons, which really gave people back their lives that the state had stolen.
As a part of this larger conversation around pushing for abolition, pushing for defunding, something that often comes up is when people say, well, the police are good at some things, or, you know, there are good cops. So let's talk about what the police are actually good at. I think it's important to realize that most of what the police does is non-criminal. 80% of Peel police activities specifically are not related to criminal activity, according to the police chief. We know crime is socially constructed and defined by underlying socioeconomic conditions and historical trauma. And so even if we can assume that the police were here to protect us, quote unquote, protect us, they regularly fail at their job. Thefts, burglaries, sexual and gender-based violence, serial killers like Bruce McArthur, and mental health responsiveness is just not something that we see them carrying out or sort of taking care of under this umbrella. And also we have to think about how crime is defined by the state. It's really just a function of underlying social and economic conditions of poverty, disempowerment, and historical trauma that come from things like colonization, imperialism, white supremacy, and capitalism. And a part of this sort of push for abolition is it's happening on the ground, but it's also happening within the way that we think too, and within the way we talk to our friends, and within the way that we create community and take care of each other. So there's something called big P and little p policing. So big P policing can be understood as the way the state functions and uses policing. So when you see cops in cop cars, uniforms, things like that, the RCMP, but then there's little p policing as well. And so that's the way that we as a society that exists in this context of colonialism, white supremacy, imperialism, and capitalism has been conditioned to police each other, right? And so when we're talking about defunding and abolishing policing, it means that we have to not only reduce budget and power of all institutions that surveil, police, punish, incarcerate, and kill Black, Indigenous, poor, disabled, homeless, mentally ill, and mad folks, as well as sex workers and queer and trans people. But so that means things like social work, certain types of healthcare systems. And so that a part of that is getting rid of the cop in your head. So, and that means getting rid of the cops in our communities. So we have to get rid of this and really confront this culture of disposability, fear, and shame, as well as really rethink the ways we think about justice, moving away from punishment, exile, carceral approaches to addressing harms. So abolition starts with us. It's not only a physical framework, it's also a mental framework, it's a community framework.
Yeah, thanks. So like you heard from Sav just a second ago, really what little p policing is asking us to do, and what abolition as a practice and as a framework asks us to do, is rethink who is responsible for community, who is responsible for care, and who is responsible for safety. So we want to emphasize that it's really thinking about the fact that we all have a responsibility to one another, and it's about transforming our relationships. I wanted to share a couple of examples of where community members have shown up for each other. So the image on the right, it's just a streetscape from Gerard India Bazaar, or Little India. There's some good documentation of how communities of color were dealing with kind of racist attacks, both explicit and implicit, especially in the 1970s. So community members actually set up a 24-hour emergency hotline for anyone who's experiencing a racist attack. Part of that was because of the frequency, and the other part of that was because any attempts to get support from kind of institutions or organizations, including the police, were not really responded to. Another example might be the flying squads. These are kind of groups of folks, self-organized, that disrupt or interrupt harmful practices. So a recent one might be QP 3903's feminist flying squad that would support workers, whether they were unionized or not. Another example might be the Bad Date Coalition. So in the context of folks engaging in sex work, there actually is a great Bad Date Coalition Toronto website where people could log information from people who have perpetuated harm and share information amongst each other to try to prioritize safety for people who are working.
Hi everyone, my name is Ruchika. Before I speak a little bit on mental illness and policing, I just want to give another content warning. There will be descriptions and instances describing police brutality. So just a reminder that we do have active listeners, and if anyone needs to kind of step away at this point or leave, that's okay to do so. And also before I explain a little bit on policing and mental illnesses in the context of Peel, I also want to name that mental illness is also like something we're not describing and talking about. It's very much present in our Zoom room. Like there's always an assumed kind of narrative that folks who are giving our information and something like organizing panel discussions like this are rational and don't have mental illnesses. I want to kind of change that narrative that there is a community of mentally ill and mad folks in this space, and it's not just something that we are describing and talking about. So really honoring that. And yeah, so I specifically want to talk about Jermaine Carby, who, as the City News said, as a New City News article explained, that he was murdered by the Peel Regional Police in Brampton on September 2014. And his coroner's toxicology report reveals that he suffered from mental health issues, including depression, and had been in the hospital seeking treatment just days before he was killed. So yeah, that's what the report kind of stated. Okay, sorry, okay. So the Office of the Independent Review Director, which for short it's ORPD or ORPID, is an independent agency responsible for managing and overseeing all public complaints related to municipal, regional, and provincial police in Ontario. So they created an interim report in March of 2017 and reviewed Carby's case and suggested that there needs to be some revisions. There needs to be some sort of change in where the Peel Regional Police actually works directly with the RCMP Canadian Police Information Center to study the possibility of enhancing information available to officers. Information like warrants and prior current details, mental health warnings, and prior de-escalations. So basically, this report was saying that if we increase surveillance, the incident that happened with Carby, where he was murdered by the police, wouldn't have occurred. We just need more information. And then the report also lists some reformist strategies for Peel Regional Police, like if they establish a criteria that experience with people in crisis will be considered, if they place a greater emphasis on de-escalation skills such as communication, empathy, proper use of force, and use of specialty teams when required, or if they also manage how they're using force and assessing where enough force is needed. So these were some of the recommendations made by this report few years after Jermaine Carby was murdered by the police. So just to kind of recap, basically what the report is stating is if the Peel Regional Police had prior access to Carby's conditions, they wouldn't have, murdered him. They wouldn't have, like this, they would have instead selected a de-escalation strategy and not inflicted violence upon him. But this puts the onus on, like the onus of responsibility on missing information about mental health warnings and not so much the structure of policing. So it's a shift of responsibility that we can see. It's not that the police was wrong in what they did or the structure of policing. It was that, oh, they didn't know Carby was experiencing a mental health crisis. But we know this is not true because on April 8th, 2020, when DeAndre Campbell called Peel Regional Police because he was experiencing a mental health crisis, they also murdered him. And this is because the institution of policing is built to murder Black, Indigenous people of color who are mentally ill. It's in structure, and this is what they're going to do. And also, we know that this past Saturday, the Peel Regional Police, who knew that Ijaz Chaudhry was schizophrenic and was experiencing a mental health crisis, was also murdered. So and this is all part of a wellness check narrative that, oh, okay, like now they have this information, they have the information that the report suggested, but these killings won't stop. So what this tells you is it's the structure of policing that is made to kill Black, Indigenous people of color who are mentally ill. So we know that the police structure is inherently anti-Black and ableist. And by ableist, I mean that that's an oppressive system that harms disabled and mentally ill people. And this is inherently built into the structure. So therefore, Peel Police is not able to support racialized folks who are mentally ill because that is not what the structure calls for. What the structure calls for is murdering racialized mentally ill people. So when the report suggests that empathetic listening and de-escalations can be used as strategies, the ORPD report, these are just distractions to help maintain the longevity of the Peel Regional Police's intention, which is to murder racialized mentally ill people. So when we hear the word mental illness crisis, we usually think about an incident or instance of mental illness that has been elevated and it's dangerous and needs to be corrected and contained by de-escalators who are typically like rational and non-mentally ill. And we know that the police can't be de-escalators because they're not designed to do that. So usually de-escalators signify like responsible people who are able to regulate and reduce the mentally ill condition of the person in crisis without inflicting harm or violence. But we must remind ourselves that mentally ill people are not disposable or need to be rescued or saved. So the language of de-escalation in mental health crisis is not always helpful because it suggests that they need to be corrected and changed in order for like the world to function. So when we imagine alternatives to policing, what if we imagine instead of de-escalation strategies or de-escalators that aim to cure and fix mentally ill people, but instead of that, what if we imagine community care that values people with mental illnesses, that doesn't see that the eradication of mental illnesses as a future that we want? So alternatives to policing that demand that budgets be replaced, like Simran pointed out earlier, in care networks such as elders, crisis and intervention teams, trauma-informed community workers, and house support workers. We also have a image on the right of the screen, and you see like turtles kind of helping and taking part of interdependency, which is a lot what community care looks like. We envision a world where we work together to ensure everyone has access to what they need, instead of like rescuing and saving mentally ill people and changing their behavior.
Thanks, Ruchika, for that really important walkthrough of alternatives to policing. Before we move on to the next section, it's really important to talk about how we can organize to win, especially as Simran pointed out earlier, work around abolition is long-term. It's been going on for a long time. We're seeing a lot of wins now, and we need to keep following through with that work. Some recent wins that Black and Indigenous organizers on the ground and other racialized organizers, as well as other co-conspirators, have accomplished are recently that the Metro Vancouver Transit Police ended their controversial agreement with the CBSA. In a landmark win, Minneapolis is now dismantling their police force as their council members pledged to do that. And that was all work that happened after George Floyd's murder, done by Black and Black queer organizers at Black Visions Collective and a lot of other groups in the city. A lot of hunger strikers released as the CBSA resisted demands to release remaining detainees. So lots of different ways of getting abolitionist work done. And also recently in Hamilton, a really big win for Ontario, abolitionist organizing is police are now no longer going to be in Hamilton high schools. So it's important when we're thinking about organizing, and especially organizing to win and maintain those wins, is that we resist performativity and representation politics. We have to follow the lead of on-the-ground organizers and communities that are most affected, specifically Black organizers, Indigenous organizers, Afro-Indigenous organizers here on Turtle Island. I think it's important that a lot of non-Black folks realize that being an ally is not enough. We need to become co-conspirators. We all have to have a stake in an abolitionist future.
We're going to shift over to talking a little bit about Peel Police. So just at a glance, I know there's quite a number of local folks who have signed up for this conversation. Here's just an overview of Peel Police. It was established in 1974 when the region was created, and it covers Mississauga and Brampton. The OPP is responsible for Caledon. Since 1974, there have been 6 police chiefs before the current. All of them have been white folks prior to the current chief. Peel Police is the 3rd largest police service in Ontario and the 4th largest municipal police service in Canada. Approximately 2,000 officers, 800 civilian employees, 5 divisions, and multiple community stations, like the one, for example, that's at Square One, inside the mall. And there's a local presence at the airport, at the University of Toronto Mississauga campus with their special constables. In high schools, every single high school in the Peel District School Board has police presence. Community organizations, for example, some gender-based violence organizations, some quote-unquote community safety organizations, work closely with the police and have police presence. A little bit about anti-Black racism and Peel Regional Police. So we actually know that Black and Indigenous communities in Peel are disproportionately harmed by our local police force. A few examples of how that happens. Locally, carding is known as street checks. So former police chief Evans actually refused to stop street checks until basically she was forced. And they are a form of racial profiling. And we know from the data that was collected that Black folks are more impacted by street checks in Peel. In schools, if you've been following the drama of the Peel District School Board and you read the minister's report, it found that Black students were arrested and charged in schools. And at the more elementary level, the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario heard a case about Peel Police who handcuffed and restrained a 6-year-old Black child for 28 minutes. And in that case, Peel Police's actions were seen as an overreaction, and their actions were deemed to be due to race. This is a distressing list. So I'll just give you a second to kind of take in all of the names that are on here. And this is certainly not everyone, but from some of the data that we've compiled, there's a gap you'll see between 1988 and 2006. We have a gap in data because of limited access to SIU information. But Peel Police has been responsible for the death of many, many, many people in its existence. In the 1980s, late 80s, when 17-year-old Michael Wade Lawson was killed, there was a lot of community organizing, and people really wanted change. And from 1998 until the 3 deaths that we know of from this year, not a lot has changed in terms of how Peel Police acts. They've also injured dozens of people, including some very well-documented cases like Orlando Bowen, who lives in Brampton and has talked publicly about his story. We'll share a link with you so you can check out his Instagram page. After being injured and attacked, actually, Peel Police officers planted drugs on him. So this is one of the tactics, one of the examples of misconduct by Peel Police. There are numerous, including perjury, so specifically lying on the stand, assault, including assault of fellow officers, usually it's gender-based, interference with investigations as well. If we follow the money, that's what we need to do, follow the money always. They have a giant budget. They have a massive budget of nearly $500 million. So they get $444 million. I think their overall budget is actually $490, but what they get from the regional tax base is $445 million. This is an increase of 5% since the year before. 40% of the region of Peel's budget goes to Peel Police, so 40 cents out of each dollar. 83% of their budget goes to labor costs. It's really just paying all of these people, thousands of people. The people harassing and murdering people in our communities are being paid to do so with no consequences and protected by one of the most dangerous unions. 91% of Peel Regional Police budget is paid for by taxpayers. So many of you in the call who live here, and the 1.3 million people who live in the region. So body cams, this has been proposed in lots of places, including Peel. And I want to honor the needs of people who have been directly impacted by violence at the hands of police, who have been calling for reform measures like body cams. So if we go back to our checklist, if you remember these questions, do body cams reduce money to the police? No. Do they reduce the scale of the police? No. And do they de-link police from ideas of safety? No. We know that body cams do not stop police brutality. We have many examples in the US of that. They are extremely expensive, and they actually funnel more money into the police. They don't take any police power away, and they increase surveillance on our communities. And when body cams combined with AI technology that lots of police forces are using, that means that our surveillance increases. Body cams legitimize the police. So what we know is happening at Friday's Police Services Board meeting is a proposal to contract Axon Canada $1.4 million each year for 5 years, with a caveat that they can add on anything else to their contract as required. And we need to be able to say no to that.
Are we good to go? Yeah, okay. I'm really excited and feel lucky to introduce Andrea. We're really lucky that she's here during this teach-in to tell everybody a bit more about the work that she's done in and around abolition. So Andrea Vasquez Jimenez is an Afro-Latina born in Toronto to Colombian parents. As co-founder and co-director of LANE, she was a lead organizer that pushed for a successful removal of the TDSB School Resource Officer Program. Andrea continues to focus on school to prison pipeline issues and is the lead organizer for LANE's #Police Free Schools Ontario-wide campaign. She is a published author and is a Master's of Education graduate from the Social Justice Education Program on the Ontario Institute of Studies and Education, also OISE for short, at the University of Toronto. Andrea is also involved in electoral politics, both as a former ONDP and NDP candidate, and as the current ONDP-NDP York Centre Riding Association president. For Andrea, whether it is in the political arena of academia or within electoral politics, she continuously leverages her privilege and access to these spaces to further community organizing efforts. I'm just gonna hand it off to Andrea now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am so grateful and humbled to be in the space, learning alongside y'all, because it really is a learning, unlearning, and relearning journey that will continue for the rest of our lifetime. And it's really important to be here alongside with community, and talking about the work of abolition, and particularly also co-creating the conditions that make liberation not only possible, but a lived reality for everyone. So once again, my name is Andrea Vasquez Jimenez, co-director of LAEN, the Latinx Afro-Latin America Avia Yala Education Network, alongside with the co-director Silvia Argentina Arauz. And at LAEN, we were a lead organization that pushed for the removal of the electoral program in 2017. I want to give a bit of context in regards to some data post the school resource officer program removal. And then just jump right into the hashtag Police Free Schools Ontario wide campaign that we have at LAEN. So since the removal of their Police in Schools program, we can find in their Caring and Safe Schools annual report, the Toronto District School Board for years of 2018 to 2019. And key findings indicate that there was a shift from punitive disciplinary practices. And instead, what's quoted in the report is that, quote, the most used interventions by schools were contacting the parent, the guardian, guidance support, social work, and restorative practices. So we see a deprioritization of the use of police officers at the Toronto District School Board. We also have data that shows that suspensions dropped 24% and expulsions plummeted 53% in comparison to the 2016-2017 school year. And the truth is that no one has indicated that they feel less, quote unquote, safe because of police not being in schools. Our LAEN campaign currently is calling for police-free schools Ontario-wide across all educational levels, including post-secondary campuses. Our hashtag police-free schools ON-wide is a recognition of that. And this is due to the urgency that this be part of the reopening plan for all educational spaces for this coming September 2020 is what we're collectively pushing for. The issue of police in schools, as many of us may already know, and the entrenchment of the school to prison pipeline is not a new issue at all, right? It's not an isolated or local issue. It's not just a one school board issue or a one post-secondary campus issue. Rather, it is a systemic issue that demands a systems response and inevitably a provincial strategy. And we know that the provincial government indeed has the power and jurisdiction to bring forward and legislate police-free schools Ontario-wide, among other things. At LAEN, Silvia Argentina and myself, we have called out the Liberal Minister of Education at that time in 2017, Mitzi Hunter, to remove police Ontario-wide. And they ignored those calls. They painted them as a local issue. Currently, this government continues to paint it as a local issue under the Conservatives, right? And so recently, the acting director of Safe and Healthy Schools, Veena Prasad, sent us at LAEN a response to one of our emails. And it was on behalf of the ministry. And they painted it once again as a local issue. And so not only is that concerning because it's not surprising that a government is not going to necessarily say, yes, we'll support you right away in these changes, right? But it's entirely not reflective of the reality. And the reality is that we know that the provincial government has the power to mandate the deprioritization of the use of police in all educational settings as an instrument of last resort, and mandate police-free schools Ontario-wide across all educational spaces and levels, since it is it's called the provincial model for a local police school board protocol. And that's in regards to the school boards. And then we have the Ontario Police Service Act in regards to the appointment of special constables, such as those campus police special constables that you also find in post-secondary campuses. So it is under the purview and jurisdiction of the provincial government. And so what we really need is political will. And so when we talk about, having healthy and equitable police-free schools, it's not something that is something that is not possible. It is very much possible, and that goes alongside Alain. One of our frameworks that we use is Black Lives Matter Toronto, We Will Win as a social justice framework. So we know that having healthy, equitable, police-free schools everywhere is possible. We also know that having healthy, equitable, police-free schools is a public health issue. It's a labor issue. And not only are police-free schools fiscally responsible and a professional obligation, it moves beyond that, because it really indeed is a legal obligation. It is a human right, and the continuation of any police in schools programs is gross negligence, and indeed is ongoing human rights violation that these educational spaces and government is being committed to. One of the things that's really important when we are talking about, abolition rather than a reform, is to be conscious of the reality that regardless whichever name the police and schools program shows up as or comes packaged in, right? Whether that be the dominantly known, school resource officer program, or the one at the Toronto Catholic District School Board they have it, and it's called the School Engagement Team program, or the Student Liaison Officer program. We have one that's called the Police Liaison Officer program, or the Campus Police Special Constable program. We know that the detrimental effects are still present. The systemic issues are still there. And so when we talk about, having and, co-creating this an equitable, anti-oppressive, anti-racist, liberatory, and life-affirming educational system, wherever it may be, is not possible with police presence. It's not possible with policing. It's not possible with criminalization happening in our schools, whether that be by police physical presence in schools, or whether that be by technological surveillance, or by social media surveillance, or by policing, in other ways. What we do know is also we don't need any more data. There's enough data, enough reports that once again are collecting dust on people's shelves. We don't need any more data. And it's important when pushing for police-free schools wherever we may be locally organizing, it's important that we don't replicate the same oppressive structures by asking for reforms, right? So we're taking an abolitionist stance. So we're not asking for reforms, whether that be, less police presence, more training, more diversity in the school police force, or instead of having police in school, to change them for security guards or technological surveillance, right? That's not what we're aiming for. And the dangers are that, for instance, in certain spaces, there could potentially be a co-optation of police-free schools movements, wherever they may be. So when demanding healthy, equitable, police-free schools, it is about the full removal of police in schools, programming, and policing structures, and redirecting and reorganizing the allocation of those funds to create the conditions and support for students to have educational spaces where they can actually heal and learn. So jumping into as to what what we actually speak to when we say police-free schools, and bringing in this entry point into abolition as a police-free schools and dismantling school to prison pipeline organizer, it's really connected, right? We have multiple entry points into the work of abolition. And so in regards to what we mean when we say police-free schools, At LAN, we take up our friends and freedom fighters and US partners, such as the Alliance for Educational Justice and Advancement Projects, their collective definition of police-free schools. And that is, and I quote from them, dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. So as police-free schools organizers, part of this global connected movement, we believe removing police from our schools is a seed for removing them from our communities. Therefore, police-free schools organizing, police-free schools, like Abolition, is a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal that's deep in critical resistance, and that is ultimately grounded in abolition. Our partners also in the US, a lot of their work also informs our work in regards to how we're moving forward with a provincial campaign, right? And this is really looking at what have been the strategies that other people have been using in their own police-free schools campaigns to ensure that we're not working in silos, to ensure that we are knowledge exchanging with other people, whether that be locally or internationally or across this colonial border, right? And so in 2017, the US-based Alliance for Educational Justice compiled strategies that groups, that organizers were using at that time in the US to win the.
I'm just gonna wait for Andrea to rejoin. There's probably some technical issues here.
Fifth is demilitarize and disarm. And all of the above strategies mount a dismantle strategy to push for police-free schools. And so we were able to connect with our partners in the US post the SRO removal at the Toronto District School Board. And when we were able to be with them, whether that be online or with other folks, such as at a Police-Free Schools US National Campaign meeting last year, we were able to knowledge exchange, learn from lessons, learn from our challenges, what worked, what didn't work. And there was partners such as folks from Philadelphia Student Union, the Black Organizing Project that was in other spaces that we had met with them. They were unable to make it that day, but there are other partners such as folks from the Brighton Park Neighborhood Council from Chicago. And so it fundamentally means that, we do keep each other safe, right? We keep us safe. And we're able to support each other because ultimately it's this ongoing collective work that really supports our own work as a collective to ensure that we do create conditions that actually recognizes the humanity of every single one of us. And that one win is a win for all of us. Right now, part of our LAN Police-Free Schools Ontario-wide campaign is to elevate, support, and continue connecting local campaigns that are happening across Ontario, pushing for police-free schools. And so that we can also, here in Ontario, coordinate knowledge exchanges and pressures on the government and local officials along with simultaneous actions, and really look to push it towards a police-free schools Canada-wide network system. We have seen the amazing local organizing that has been happening for years, huge shout out that y'all had mentioned also, the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board Kids Need Help student-led collective that has been doing this work for about 4 years. They've been putting in the work, community organizing, and collectively they are able to drive a win for the termination of the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board police liaison officer program yesterday, right? We see folks out in Waterloo region that we've connected with that have been leading the work there, such as the student-led collective Students for Inclusive Schools, alongside the African Caribbean and Black Network of Waterloo region. Right? We have even folks working at the post-secondary campus level. There's people that have been working locally, like Cop Free Campus Collective, that's working around McMaster University. There's a student, a Burnaby student-led collective that's working for police-free schools out in, British Columbia, right? There was also a recent win by the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy at Ryerson University and the Black Liberation Collective to ensure, in the first place, to keep the campus police special constable program out, right? And so there has been years and years of organizing that people have been doing locally, that inevitably connecting each other, supporting each other, elevating each other's voices, and placing that much more pressure. We know that we will win police-free schools Ontario-wide. And so what does it mean when, when a particular entry point into abolition, so for instance, police-free schools, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're supposed to stop there, right? So how is it that we actually connect our social movements? So for instance, we know that there's a continuum of policing in spaces, right? So for instance, the presence of policing via special constables they're appointed with the same powers of police, but they're not only present in educational spaces. They're present in housing, they're present in transit. There's more than 3,000 special constables across Ontario, right? So when we're talking about how is it that, once again, we use our privileges and whichever spaces that we have access to, how do we push and support each other's movements? How is it that whenever I'm talking about police-free schools, I'm also talking about, police-free transit, police-free housing, right? Ensuring that we're actually supporting each other and, once again, not working in silos. And building off, what y'all were speaking to in regards to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, I really have been thinking a lot more in regards to what they mentioned about, abolition being about presence, it being about life-affirming institutions. And I think that is so powerful because in many instances, and it is challenging as, many times as community organizers, when we feel that we're dismantling, but simultaneously we have to remember to co-create, right? And so how is it that we ourselves co-create life-affirming spaces for each other to be a vision to create life-affirming institutions? We know that liberatory and life-affirming spaces are not possible with police presence, policing, criminalization happening in our schools or any other spaces for that matter. So once again, what does it mean and what does it look like to actualize life-affirming spaces for everyone? What is it that we visualize ourselves when we do go into this collective visioning, which I find, visioning is remarkably important because we are all, power generators. We are manifestors, and collective vision is part of this work. And so, right now I've shared, a few minutes ago, I have shared our petition that we have, our land campaign petition calling on for police-free schools Ontario-wide. Have shared also a Google form document that folks can, sign up. And it really is about, we're trying to locate folks that have already been doing this work that we have yet to connect with so that we can support each other, as well if folks haven't, been involved in police-free schools work, but it's something that they may be interested in. They can fill out, and we'll be doing a political teach-in in the near future. So once again, that we can support each other in a movement that seeds abolition in our schools, province-wide, so that we can definitely seed abolition in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that incredibly energizing sort of entry into collective visioning and really being like life affirming. That's so core to this work. We're not always anti, we're actually constructing a new world as we're doing this. So thank you so much for offering that and offering very, very concrete lessons and places to look into to see who's already doing this work. So next steps that we're going into, just to sort of cap off before we go into our collective visioning. We know we're also running behind time, so if folks do need to leave, that's totally okay. We'll also have a recording up afterwards, though not of the Q&A. So a lot of folks have reached out to us. Sorry, I just want to make sure that there's a closed captioner. Yeah, okay. Yeah, a lot of people did ask, how can they plug in? How can they support this type of movement? And so we have this list of activities and sort of steps people can take. Firstly, though, grounding that in this quote by Mariam Kaba, is we have to act with the urgency of the moment and the patience of 1,000 years, right? We have to be really patient and slow with each other, and at the same time, walk with a lot of urgency. So a couple of items that folks can take on collectively is to collectivize safety, to also decarcerate our minds as we're doing this work, doing the personal work, to start a reading group, either with your friends. You can also join with Climate Justice Peel in our reading group on abolition, and you can begin with works like Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis, and we can share resources afterwards as well. You can do political advocacy actions like LAN's collective local action, petition, letter writing and email writing. People have already been doing this, but really personalizing those emails to people so that the staff of elected representatives know that this is real. And delivering deputations at board meetings. So we know that more than 80 people delivered deputation actually for Friday's police services board meeting, calling for defunding the police, which is incredible. You can also organize, so joining a grassroots organizing group and learning how to work in collectives is really important. And if you're a union steward or a teacher, we know some folks in the labor and education movement also are joining us today. You can resist the power of cops wherever you are and educate your fellow coworkers or students on abolitionist principles. You can show up to community-led rallies and actions if it's safe for you to do so. And you can also donate to GoFundMes of the families who've been affected in Peel. That's Jamal Francisque, DeAndre Campbell, and Ijaz Chowdhury. And on that note, there is actually a continuing protest and sit-in in Malton at Goreway and Morningstar, and folks are asking for tents. So if you can donate tents or any other material supports, the community would appreciate it. You can check at Justice for Ijaz, Justice, the number 4, Ijaz on Instagram. And there's also Afro-Indigenous Rising Collective that is currently holding a sit-in at Nathan Phillips Square. They're several nights into this and they've been occupying that space, and they're asking for more folks to join in downtown and asking for monetary donations to get more details. And so these are just a few things, and of course watching the police services board meeting on Friday. And so on the next slide you'll see there's a link. We'll share this afterwards, and we'll also be doing what is the word? Community watch session, and we'll send out an RSVP link for that so that we can be together while watching that on Friday morning. So I'm going to hand it off to Sav, who's going to do a short collective visioning exercise, and then we'll have some time for questions and hopefully prioritizing some questions for Andrea as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Simran. Thanks for also going over all of those next steps. They're really important. Just want to really ground what Andrea said during her piece, that collective visioning is so important to all sorts of community organizing and work, especially abolitionist work. It's about co-creating these life-affirming spaces for each other. It's not just about anti, like Simran was saying, but we're pro-life, we're pro-community, we're pro-love and care and all those things. Not to be corny, but, and I think as we're going through this visioning exercise, I think it's really important to sort of not have this idea of utopias floating around in our head, because when you have a utopia, it automatically means that you have a dystopia. And in the world that we live in now, there are people living in quote unquote utopias and so many others living in dystopias. So that's not what the goal of this visioning exercise is. Instead, it's meant to sort of be this collaborative process towards imagining a just future or just futures. It's an exercise that wants our world to look radically different than it is. And so like sort of thinking through these kinds of realities that we want to happen. So this quote from Enough is Enough, a 150-year performance review of the Minneapolis Police Department, sort of walks us through thinking about that. So the quote goes, imagine that you are asked to help create stability in a newly founded city. How would you try to solve the problems that your friends and neighbors encountered? How would you respond to a crisis and violence? Would your first choice be an accountable army with a history of oppression and violence, patrolling your neighborhood around the clock? This is a really big ask. So we've broken it down a little bit into a couple of questions that you can hold for the purpose of this exercise. If we could just go to, thank you. So these are just some questions to hold and think through as we sort of imagine what this could look like, what we want it to look like, what we hope for it to look like. So what do we already do well? Think about your family dynamics, your friend circles, your greater community connections, sort of the histories of the places you come from, right? The things that your parents, your grandparents tell you about your community specifically. What are these things that we already do to take care of each other and hold each other accountable that exist outside of carceral forms of policing and other forms of policing? Also, what are the ways in which I and the people around me engage in both big P and little p policing? Keeping that in mind as we're doing this exercise so that we can begin to move away from those violent frameworks and just not reiterate them in the way that we imagine a better and more just future. And so to sort of map out everybody's ideas, you can go to this website called menti.com. You can also like do that thing that I don't know a lot about technology, but your phone has the scanning thing. And so you can either do that or go directly to the website and enter that code, and it will take you to a sort of like a question thing that you can put your answer in, and it'll map out everybody's answers and ideas. So I think someone's going to pull that up and make it look cool. And so the big question to sort of hold is, what do I need to feel cared for, and what do we already do well to take care of each other and hold folks accountable, and just sort of work through that. Okay, these all look really, really great. It's so good to see all of this activity and collaboration. I'm seeing a lot of things around moving with a love ethic, a lot of things of anti-hierarchy, redistributing resources, affordable housing, Black liberation, Indigenous sovereignty, more funding allocated to things like art. It's really amazing. Thank you all for participating in this and holding space for this collective visioning exercise. There's a lot of important threads that have been brought up, and hopefully as we walk away from the session, we can continue to sort of hold them and work through them and share these ideas with other folks. We're gonna move into our Q&A session now. So yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna just pose questions to any of our speakers today, and folks can answer as they feel comfortable. Just bear with me for a second.
Shreya, just as you're doing that, I just will mention, we know that activity felt kind of short, but we'll also be sharing all of these brilliant ideas that came out with all of you afterwards in a summary, hopefully like some kind of beautiful graphic.
Okay, so we have one question here. A lot of panelists, actually all of you speakers talked about not recreating any sort of policing systems in our communities. So could you talk about how this is also reproduced in social work or in psychiatry, psychotherapy? So these quote unquote systems of care or the care industrial complex. So yeah, anyone who wants to go first, please do so. Just give a moment for closed captioning to catch up.
Is closed captioning caught up? Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think if we think about social work is a really prime example in Canada with the 60s scoop and the child welfare program. Like it in the 60s, they would forcefully remove Indigenous children from their families and like house them because there was this whole harmful colonial kind of racist narrative that Indigenous peoples are not equipped to take care of their own kids. A lot of like racist policies around like naming Indigenous people as like savages and just really harmful things that brought like that would remove these children from their house from Indigenous households and bring them to the to social workers. Now it continues with the child welfare organizations that continue to do the same thing, the forced removal of Indigenous children when parents are seen as too unstable to take care of their children. And this reproduces like a lot of ableist harm in names of like mental health and like really, really problematic um, understandings of what Indigenous caretaking and Indigenous like ways of familial relationships kind of operate. Yeah, and I feel like this is reproduced in the like in social work today because it comes from a foundation of like saving children, saving racialized children through whiteness, through white social workers, and really forms a colonial kind of understanding of what care looks like, but it's not care as we know.
Does anyone want to contribute to what Rachika said?
Yeah, I think, this is such a huge, not only question, but a reality that we have to think through in our movements, right? Like one of the things in regards to what we're petitioning for is obviously the divestment of those funds that are used to police and criminalize students, and to invest those in things that are grounded, in restorative and transformative justice practices, healing-centered engagement, and alternatives that are relationship-centered, right? But when we also think about alternatives, dominant alternatives, in many instances, social workers come up, guidance counselors come up, nurses come up, also mental health workers. And I think even on a spectrum of essentially any institution that we've had present is colonial, is embedded in white supremacy. We're within these colonial structures. So what does it mean when we're talking about, investing funds into alternatives that have yet to be created anew, right? And so some of the things when we're looking, like some of our, like in regards to, I guess, like folks would talk about main talking points, we would mention, there's a spectrum of alternatives that includes having, elders in these educational spaces. That means knowledge, indigenous knowledge keepers in these spaces, right? So the more non-dominant alternatives that communities have been already doing from time, to have them in those spaces. And then also when speaking about, having, we need additional educational assistance, we need social workers, really ensuring that it's not decoupled away from, it could be any social worker or any mental health worker, right? It's really ensuring that not only are they to be representative of the communities that they are serving and have ties, intimate ties to that community, but also that there be evidence that their work, whether that be social work, mental health work, among other intersectional types of work, that it be fundamentally embedded in an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, abolitionist, equitable lens, right? And so we know that there are folks that, many of us may already know, that are in the system to also utilize those spaces to, ensure in a way a form of harm reduction. So I think it's really particularly difficult because we have to, continuously co-create these new ways anew that aren't social work, that aren't mental health workers, that aren't. But meanwhile, we have to ensure that those caring adults that are in those spaces do have a politic that anchors them.
Yeah, I just want to, extend that analysis as well to the current moment. The media is focusing a lot on long-term care and, elders really bearing the brunt of the pandemic. But it's also a result of our society prioritizing in the most capitalist way possible the institutionalization and really the incarceration of elders. And if we all invested in some kind of universal home care program where people could actually also be with their family while being cared for, and that the people caring for them, which is mostly actually Black and Filipino women, that they're paid well, then we actually invest in care that also doesn't reproduce carceral ways of caring. So just wanted to add that.
Awesome. Okay, so as you can see, there is a question in the chat as well. And so two of them are asking, there's a similarity in between them. They're asking how abolition can look. And there are there need to be considerations of folks who are within systems of incarceration right now. So again, just not uprooting all these systems overnight and taking great care to make sure that those folks are looked after and have adequate supports. So combining both of those questions, as well as one that was pre-submitted that I think is really urgent for us to address here in Peel, And some of you folks, might have experience answering this question, but how do you explain defunding of the Peel Police budget and just abolition at large to pro-police family members? Specifically, this question is considering the large South Asian community present in Peel and talking about connections between tyranny of police back home in South Asia and tyranny of police here.
I can take that on. It's hard because so many people, especially in the South Asian community, and I won't spend too much time on this because I think we need our own sort of platform to talk about how internally in our communities, like a lot of people in our families end up being employed by policing forces. And so I think for me personally, I think it matters not only that we have conversations with family, but that our movement becomes so strong and big and irresistible and just common sense that like even the people who have relationships with people who are cops are like, this is going too far, and like this movement is so powerful that I have no choice but to support it. That we create a line and we say, you're either with us or you're with the oppressive forces. And that's usually how change happens. You make oppression so just like politically damning and inconvenient, even to people related to those in power, that we win. And I think that's very much possible. And I know that's a big question, but like I think this is a start where we're sharing vocabulary and language with each other to talk about it.
I might want to add to that a bit by so the question of talking to loved ones or pro-police folks that we might be close to. And I think it's really important to sort of connect just the project of state making back home, wherever that is. State making in all its forms is really like oppressive. And so if we connect that to how Canada is upholding settler colonialism here through all of their state agents and people who are enacting violence, we can see that the commonality has always been resistance from working class, oppressed, lower caste, and otherwise marginalized folks. And so I think one really important thing that helps is I think a lot of people are talking about the model minority myth right now and talking about how the Canadian government relies on, a faction of non-Indigenous and non-Black folks, specifically often East Asian and South Asian folks, to uphold this model minority myth. And so you see a lot of South Asian police officers, for example, in Peel region who, and like RCMP officers who celebrate wins such as being able to forgo wearing like the police Stetson and instead wear like religion, like a turban or a hijab and on the job. And so these things, in the view of pro-police, in a pro-police view, could be seen as a win, but it's important to remember that these specific examples are being upheld as a huge, huge success when it doesn't at all take away from the material violence that is caused by these cops, regardless of if they come from our own communities. So it's really important to resist essentially pedestaling one or two, a handful of examples, because that again reinforces the bad apple rhetoric of, this problem is isolated to a few individuals and not the system at large. So I think that's part of it as well. Yeah, Andrea?
Yeah, and just I think adding to that, when people have a difficulty of imagining police not in their communities, right? This reduction of scope of police in communities is already a reality. Not for all communities, but in particularly in white dominant, middle class, upper class communities, right? And so it is already a reality in many spaces. And also when we think about, you know, a lot of folks that say they're fiscally conservative, right? Well, police abolition is actually the fiscally responsible thing to do, right? And so when we even think about like the amount of loopholes that our governments have in regards to tax havens, right? A new parliamentary budget office report shows that the top 1% amass 25% of Canada's wealth, right? And the bottom 40% of families share barely 1%, right? And I think the connections in regards to the conditions and the scope of policing and criminalizing has grown so large that, there's criminalization of poverty, criminalization of houselessness, criminalization of many of these social conditions, that if we were to actually prioritize the well-being of people, you wouldn't really need policing and criminalization of people, because you would then have housing as a right. We would have free transit. We would not have, issues around, is there enough food in the refrigerator? Do we have enough food to eat, right? These basic needs and basic conditions, not to just survive, but to actually be able to thrive, would be covered. And even I think, I've learned so much from y'all, even with the stats that y'all were showing in regards to 80% of the issues are not necessarily not even criminal matters, for a lack of a better term. So, folks have already been talking from time about how to, once again, reduce the scope, right? What does it mean to have crisis response teams when there is, mental health crises? What does it mean to have folks to, support traffic, right? Instead of a police officer? What does it mean to do all of these things in a way that it's community led alternatives and not police? And so we can definitely see a reduction, maybe not an abolition overnight, but definitely a reduction of that scope done quite swiftly and quickly.
Thank you. So we're gonna do one final question, and I hope to combine a few in this one. And then also, just to honor folks' time, just another reminder that the transcript for this webinar, as well as the video with captions, is going to be available afterwards. So this final question is asking, there's a lot of talk of the illegitimacy of police unions, and how is that congruent with resistance in labor organizing, so specifically abolitionist resistance in labor organizing? And can you also speak on how abolition is being mobilized in healthcare or like nursing unions? It's a large question. I'm trying to honor a lot of different thoughts here. So just take your time, and whoever wants to go ahead can.
Well, I will admit, I don't know everything to know about healthcare unions and abolition. But someone just commented here, we need to kick the police out of CUPE and OPSU, which are two pretty big unions here. And yeah, cops are not workers. Let's start there. They're not workers. They, as we said earlier, have a history of breaking strikes. We saw the RCMP break the strike in the prairies a couple of months ago. We saw also, the RCMP and other police officers break the 1919 Winnipeg strike. Literally any worker strike where they're standing up for their rights, the cops are there to protect not workers, but the employer and property and capital and the interests of the state. And so police unions actually exist to exonerate and protect police officers and make sure they get coin even when they've actually killed someone or harmed someone. So cops shouldn't have unions. And one way that we can actually fight for abolitionist reforms is by making sure that labor councils, for instance, don't have relationships or include police unions in their labor councils, or ensuring that police unions are not recognized by the broader labor movement. And even in Peel, for a Warehouse Workers Center, for a lot of the unions here, starting to build abolitionist awareness among workers to say that the police are not here to protect you, and beginning to have that conversation, I think, is really important.
And I can very quickly touch on that healthcare piece by referencing what Ruchika was saying earlier about this really lethal exchange of information between healthcare institutions and police in terms of information that would criminalize and pathologize people in distress. So, for example, in the case of DeAndre Campbell, disclosures to cops about the state of DeAndre's mental health, or Ijaz Chaudhry, same thing. And so really keeping this critical information out of the hands of lethal and violent institutions, and reducing chances for that kind of surveillance. And also just thinking along the lines of abolition, just in terms of the way we build life-affirming institutions, as Andrea said, reflecting on Ruth Wilson Gilmore, in how doctors go about taking care of folks, right? So how doctors police binaries in terms of the access that trans and non-binary folks have to the medical system, and how these life-affirming processes can often result in reduced interactions with law enforcement because of more successful chances for mental well-being. It is really a cyclical thing, like a life-affirming processes in healthcare, such as rights to contraceptives, rights to abortion, all of these things being sustained really, really mitigates the need for intervention from lethal force. So I hope that isn't a really abstract answer. There are, again, we are going to share some research that specifically talk about abolition in all of these sectors, because these are really pressing conversations. But that more or less wraps up our question and answer period.
Andrea, did you have any other sort of final words to share? Any additional calls to action? We know a lot of teachers were watching and students, and so I'm sure they're also wondering how to just kind of plug into this movement.
Yeah, definitely. So on our social media, hopefully this week, if not by next week, we are going to be sending out an open letter to labor unions, to community organizations, to educational spaces, to student caucuses, to also spiritual leaders, among many other folks, to sign on to the open letter. And we are going to be, we're still circulating the petition. So if folks haven't signed on the petition, please sign on. And also if folks, once again, if they have never done, police-free schools organizing, but are interested in organizing locally, please sign up. Or if you're already organizing, we want to connect with you, please sign on to our Google form. We really want to ensure that we're building each other up into this collective movement for police-free schools Ontario-wide, and really reimagining what that looks like for September 2020. We're really pushing it for a reopening plan for all educational spaces. So yeah, definitely connect with us. Our email is laentoronto@gmail.com. Again, laentoronto@gmail.com. And yeah, just get in the movement. Like, we'll support each other and we will win. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So as we wrap up, just again want to draw attention to some upcoming actions and ways you can explicitly show support. Climate Justice Peel will be hosting a group watching session of the Peel Police Board meeting, which is at 10 a.m. on the 26th. So stay tuned for the Zoom link for that. And then also there are plans of a demonstration for Ijaz Chaudhry on this upcoming Saturday at the Peel Police headquarters. And then also there is a demonstration by Peel's March for Justice on June 27th at 4:30 p.m. In front of the Peel District School Board headquarters. So that was a lot to take in, and it will be all shared on our socials, as well as links, how to RSVP and how to attend. And you're more than welcome to attend with us and hold space with us if you are showing up for your first time and don't want to be alone. You're not alone in this, and we really, really appreciate folks showing up. Special thanks to our closed captioners today, really staying on task with our first webinar and trying to tackle all of the tech stuff. This is a learning experience for us, and we hope it was for you too. Thank you, Andrea, for joining us. We're really, really grateful to hear about the work that you have been doing on the ground for quite some time. And thank you to all of you attendees. Please spread word with your loved ones, your friends, your communities, and we really hope to see you showing support both on the ground, but in all the capacities that you can. So thank you.